Welcome back to the Bible Lore Podcast, Episode 11, The Gods of Israel. Now, hold your horses, don't yell at me because you expected Bury Your Queens Part 2. That's coming next time, but as I was writing this, I had to delay the conclusion of the story of Jezebel and Ahab because to understand them better, I wanted to talk about the gods that they worshipped, and it just got too long to give the king and queen their proper due. Next time, though, I promise, we'll get there. Last time, we saw kingdoms and empires rise in the 10th and early 9th centuries, resulting in a handful of our first confirmed, real historical characters in the Bible. The Egyptian pharaoh Shishak, the Israelite king Omri, and his son and successor Ahab. We also looked at God's wife, Asherah, who would centuries later become persona non grata according to the Bible's authors and redactors, and we introduced Jezebel, Ahab's Phoenician wife, whose very name would become shorthand for a wicked woman. Before we get too deep into the episode, I'd like to also preemptively address one objection that some have made to the description of Yahweh and his Asherah in the Kuntalet Ajrud and Khirbet el-Qam inscriptions as describing Yahweh and his wife Asherah, as opposed to merely a cultic object called an Asherah that represented Asherah. First, it seems a distinction without much of a difference to split hairs on this and state that it's only the cultic object that represents a consort goddess of other pantheons, and not the goddess herself, one that I think is often based out of obvious biases that are theological in nature. And second, as several scholars have noted, utilizing what's called a third-person pronomial suffix after a personal name, as is done in these inscriptions, is not unique to these inscriptions. It's done in other Semitic inscriptions, and thanks to the brilliant Chrissy Hansen for pointing this out, I'll link to a comment she made that goes over the scholarship if you want to be a huge nerd about it. Moving on from fake-ass linguistic stuff, though. This time, we're finally bringing Yahweh into the fold and talking about where he came from and how he's conceived in the earliest layers that we can find in the Bible. Ahab's reign is when we see Yahweh show up in the historical record for the very first time since perhaps the Shasu of Yahu inscriptions in the Ramesside period in Egypt, some 400 years prior, if that even referred to Yahweh, and if it even referred to him as a god. So it's time we figure out just who this god is and what he's like. There's a lot of Bible reading in this episode, so if you've been champing at the bit to hear me read from the good book, we're finally diving into it. Two sources deserve mention up top: Theodore Lewis's The Origin and Character of God, and Christian Frevel's When and From Where Did Yahweh Emerge? As always, all other sources will be listed in the bibliography portion of the description of the episode. After the death of his father Omri, Ahab became king in the mid-870s, with his Baal-worshipping Phoenician wife Jezebel at his side. Omri had consolidated power and claimed a region of control that would represent a minor peak of Israelite independence and influence, with his kingdom reaching southeast across the Dead Sea into Moab, modern-day western Jordan. The Moabites do not seem to have been too pleased with their Israelite rulers. More on that later. A few years after Ahab's ascension, King Asa of Judah died, and his son Jehoshaphat became king. Christian Frevel notes that this may be where the king's lists of Israel and Judah started, the beginnings of the more accurate sources that later writers would be able to work with, even if they did add their own theological and literary angles to the texts, which was the style at the time.
So I tied an onion to my belt, which was the style at the time.
In the first 7 books of the Bible, what some scholars call the Tetratuch, there are very few, in fact, almost no names that contain Yahweh as a theophoric element. Around the time of Omri and Ahab, however, Yahwistic names are suddenly all over the place, and within a few decades of Omri's death, we start to get our first secure archaeological mentions of Yahweh as a god. As we discussed in the last episode, there's Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah at Kuntalet Ajrud, and there's, of course, Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. Yeho is Yahweh. Suddenly, Yahweh is everywhere in the second half of the 9th century, after the reigns of Omri and Jehoshaphat, including all of the archaeological finds that we discussed last episode. It's been suggested by some scholars that Yahweh of Samaria in the north was Baal, and that this is why there's a southern invective against him. But if this is the case, that the Southerners believed in some version of Yahweh that did not include Baal's influence, he's not really in the Bible as we have it. As it stands, Yahweh is, in many ways, very similar to Baal. I'll give a brief summary of the similarities between Baal and Yahweh without going into full detail, as the previous episodes of this show, especially episode 4, have given Baal a fair bit of airtime already. But as a refresher, in the Ugaritic texts, Baal is described as the cloud rider. In Psalm 68, Yahweh is described as him who rides on the clouds, though some have argued that the Ugaritic text is closer to another reconstructed storm god epithet, Zeus as the gatherer of the clouds. That view is mostly out of fashion, despite other similarities between Zeus, Baal, and Yahweh. Another reconstruction of Psalm 68's cloud rider epithet is that it's he who rides over the steppe lands, perhaps rides on a cloud over the steppe, but overall, it's very similar. In the Ugaritic texts, Baal is described as battling the sea serpent Litan and the primordial sea Yam. In Genesis 1, God splits the sea, Tehom, and throughout the Bible, Yahweh is repeatedly described as having fought the sea serpent Leviathan, Litan's cognate. This is perhaps the most significant visibility into the direct influence of Baal on Yahweh, as the phrase from Isaiah 27 describes Yahweh battling Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, the twisting serpent, which is found also in the Baal cycle. Baal is portrayed as battling death, being swallowed by Mot before returning to restore life to the land. In Isaiah 25, the author plays with this legend by imagining a day when Yahweh will swallow death, Mavet, forever. Baal is broadly viewed as a storm warrior god who controls the weather. Yahweh is also shown as leading the Israelites in a pillar of cloud, and storms and storm clouds are often associated with him, such as in Psalm 18, quote, "He made darkness his covering around him, his canopy thick clouds dark with water. Out of the brightness before him there broke through his clouds hailstones and coals of fire." Scholar John Day notes that in a text from Ugarit, Baal is described as having 7 lightnings and 8 storehouses of thunder, similar to the 4 winds of the storm god Marduk in the Enuma Elish and the 13 winds of the sun god Shamash in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Psalm 29 describes Yahweh's powers over nature, and it became viewed as a prayer for rain among later Jewish interpreters. It's not terribly long, so I'll read it out here. Quote, "Ascribe to Yahweh, O sons of the gods. Ascribe to Yahweh glory and strength. Ascribe to Yahweh the kavod of his name. Bow down to Yahweh, majestic in holiness. The voice of Yahweh is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. Yahweh over the mighty waters. The voice of Yahweh is power. The voice of Yahweh is majesty. The voice of Yahweh breaks cedars. Yahweh shatters the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon skip like a calf, Sirion like a young wild ox. The voice of Yahweh kindles flames of fire. The voice of Yahweh convulses the wilderness. Yahweh convulses the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of Yahweh causes hinds to calve, and strips forests bare. While in his temple all say glory, Yahweh sat enthroned at the flood. Yahweh sits enthroned, king forever. May Yahweh grant strength to his people. May Yahweh bestow on his people well-being." So in this psalm, we have many parallels to Baal. Yahweh receiving glory from the lower tier gods, here called the sons of the gods, the B'nai Elohim. We also have Yahweh at northern locations like Lebanon, Sirion, and Kadesh. Here likely not referencing the Judahite Kadesh, but one of Baal's northern locales. And Yahweh as the Lord over the flood, the cosmic waters at the beginning of time, a title that Baal is given in the same text that describes him as having 7 lightnings and 8 thunders at Ugarit. To really hammer this home, Yahweh's thunderous voice is given 7 lines, paralleling the fragmentary text, leading many scholars to believe that Psalm 29 may have developed pretty directly from a song praising Baal. It may have been a Baalic hymn that was adapted to be about Yahweh instead. So there's Baal and Yahweh. Despite the later condemnations of Baal, his fingerprints as a Canaanite storm god are all over Yahweh. The second layer we need to strip away from Yahweh to get to the original version of the god, whoever he was, is El. Unlike Baal, El was never condemned, but rather subsumed into Yahweh. And because his name can be a generic term for God, we can still see El portrayed as distinct from Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible in a few different ways. As long as they didn't go too far from what God's character was supposed to be, these El traditions were not removed from the Bible. They were not censored or redacted away, the way that, for example, that Baalic hymn was adapted to be about Yahweh. Sometimes the El traditions stand on their own. To figure out who he was, though, Lewis sums it up beautifully in describing who El is not. Quote, El is not a combat deity who slays cosmic creatures the likes of Leviathan and Yam, nor a vegetative deity who battles the forces of death, Mot, nor is he a storm deity who uses the voice of lightning to manifest his nature. Israelite El is not associated with human sacrifice. His origin is never said to have been from the land south-southeast of the Dead Sea, Seir, Taman, Paran, Midian, although some traditions localize him in the vicinity. End quote. And so El is the loving father, he's famously our drunken good times god, and he's an extremely powerful deity, but he's not as associated with big cosmic combat. He's not primarily a warrior god. He's the level-headed commander-in-chief, maybe, but he's not the one going out and winning battles for you. He's not Baal, in other words. But let's move beyond our pre-biblical texts and into the Hebrew scriptures. El is described as El Roy in passages like Genesis 16:13, often rendered as the god of seeing in modern translations, though it's not so cut and dry. It's possible that Roy here references that he's El, the god who cannot be seen due to his lethality. In the Bible and much of the ancient world, seeing divinity was associated with death. Moses, Yahweh's favorite, is only allowed to see his back because any more might kill him. The common meme today is that so-called biblically accurate angels are so bizarre-looking to human eyes that it would terrify whoever encountered one. But the chimeric creatures with many eyes that people are referencing in this meme are not angels. Instead, angels, the messengers of the gods, say be not afraid in some passages because they were visible manifestations of deities, sometimes even God himself. In many cases, when it says the angel of the Lord in a translation, it possibly is even an edit to conceal that it's Yahweh himself who appears to a chosen person, and seeing a god was thought to be lethal. If this is the case, then later authors inherited the idea that seeing merely Yahweh's angel was enough to put the fear of death in someone, a level of danger that they may not have enjoyed before this development. But El Roy, as the chief god of the pantheon, would have been especially deadly, and he may have come with his own infamous band of notorious messengers, the Malachim, the angels. And along with lethality, El's position as chief of the gods is stressed. He's El Elyon, usually translated as the Most High God, and even the name Israel could have possibly meant something similar. Instead of meaning something like El contends or wrestles with El, as in the Jacob story, the wrestling and contention might have meant that El reigned over all other gods, the champion of the cosmic deity wrestling match. He's also El Olam, which can be translated as the Eternal One or the Ancient One. In some contemporary texts, he's portrayed as an elderly man, though sometimes he's also portrayed as young and virile. We have to remember that these are human perceptions and conceptions of their gods, and inconsistency is the rule, not the exception. And with that human subjectivity, El is often localized, famously at Bethel, the house of El. From a traditionalist perspective, El and Yahweh are said to have always been two names for the same God, or in especially conservative spaces, folks will argue that El was never God's name, so much as a generic name for a god. On the one hand, it's true that El or Elohim can just refer generically to a god, gods, or the God of the Bible. Like the word Deus in Latin translations of the Bible doesn't mean that Catholics are worshiping Zeus. But in addition to all of the other evidence we've discussed in past episodes, Lewis points out that Bethel provides even more confirmation that El worship is visible in the names and traditions collected in the Hebrew Bible, saying, quote, in light of similar places such as Beth Anat, Beth Horon, Beth Dagon, Beth Shemesh, Beth Baal Meon, and so on, it seems more likely that Bethel, at least originally, contained a reference to the deity El, end quote. So like other gods, El and Yahweh could have local manifestations and, naturally, local shrines and temples to house the god. Yahweh, whether he actually originated from peoples who lived there or not, is said in the Bible's lore to have had his start as a god who made his home in southern mountains like Sinai and Horeb, where Moses encounters him for the first time, typically placed in northwest Saudi Arabia or on the Sinai Peninsula. El, on the other hand, seems to have come from the north and is rarely associated in the Bible with southern locales, which aligns nicely with the northern Israel, having El as its original patron god. Perhaps El's most famous epithet in the Bible, though, is Shaddai or Shaddai. In the strand of the Torah that emphasizes that Yahweh is El, it's usually not just El that's described, but El Shaddai that is referenced. In Exodus 6, when Moses meets Yahweh, the God tells him that to his ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he only made himself known as El Shaddai. Usually El Shaddai is translated as God Almighty, but once again, the translation itself is much more contested than the ubiquity of the term we're used to hearing might convey. God Almighty, in other words, is probably an invention of later transmission, translation, and tradition rather than what El Shaddai originally meant. Lewis identifies a few potential reconstructions to look at, and we'll start with geographic locations. First, we've got El Shaddai as El of the Steppelands, or El of the Wilderness, based on the Hebrew word Shaddai, and some texts in Amarna and Ugarit, including one that views El as a hunter in the wilderness. It's very possible, though we don't have a ton of evidence to support it outside of the linguistic argument. As a guy who grew up in the shrub steppe of eastern Washington, I would love for this to be the case. But Lewis also notes that some, though not all, of the push for this as the correct and only reconstruction comes from a reaction to another proposed meaning, El Shaddai as the god of the mountain, based on similarity to the word for breast. That's right, it's El, the god of Breast Mountain.
Boobs, zonkers, headlights, watermelons, sweater puppies, pointers, knockers, jugs.
Thank you, Geraldo. First, let's get the more salacious part out of the way. As we discussed last time with Asherah, nursing was and is an incredibly important part of human life, and so it shouldn't come as a surprise that deities are thought to possess the life-giving powers of the breast and the womb. Eventually, when Yahweh divorces Asherah, he will inherit some of these life-giving traits from her, which has allowed more progressive theologians to claim gender inclusivity in the Bible's God. In El Shaddai's case, we don't have much of that beyond the name of Shaddai being cognate in some way with the word for breast. But there is an interesting connection in Genesis 49, quote from Francesca Stavrakopoulou's translation. From the God of your ancestor, who supports you, from Shaddai, who blesses you, the blessings of heaven above, the blessings of deep crouching below, the blessings of breasts and womb, the blessing of your Father, warrior most high, the blessings of the everlasting mountains, the blessings of the outlying eternal hills. Interestingly, at Ugarit, we see the same epithet, breasts and womb, tied to Asherah as El's consort. And here we see it tied to Shaddai and to mountains, giving us a potential glimpse into their pre-divorce past. For Shaddai as breast mountain, there's also the fact that mountains kind of look like boobs sometimes, leading to a pretty natural connection. Gods live on the mountains, mountains look like breasts. Sometimes the words for mountain and breast are similar. Put it all together and you get God is the god of breast mountain. Sometimes things are really just that straightforward. On the other hand, the name Tsuri Shaddai, in Numbers 1, meaning Shaddai is my rock, gives us a good idea of what this mountainous name would have meant to folks before it evolved into the word Almighty. Something like Shaddai is my foundation and the peak, as in the highest point. El Shaddai is the rock undergirding their existence, but he's also the head of the pantheon. A mountain makes a great metaphor for this kind of god. But as the god of Breast Mountain, El Shaddai is also associated in Psalm 68 with non-metaphorical mountains, in this case, Bashan and Salmon. And this shouldn't surprise us. High places are often mentioned in the Bible, called Bamot in Hebrew, usually associated with Masavot, which means standing stones, and usually condemned when mentioned using these specific terms. Every king in the Book of Kings is judged good or bad by whether they tore down the Massabot and the high places. These are hilltop and mountaintop shrines and places of worship and sacrifice, like Mount Olympus and Mount Zion. Gods were thought to live at the highest peaks, the towering bergs of nature that left an impression on all who saw them. And the way to gain greater access to the gods, to be literally closer to them, was to hike up to the top of the biggest hill in your area. The majestic panoramas from these vantage points gave ancient people a god's eye view of the world around them. So it seems to have been with Shaddai. Despite the later condemnations, in poetry and prophetic oracles especially, mentions of these high places and even standing stones could get past the redactor's hand. We've already discussed Jacob setting up shrines at Bethel and Shechem in Genesis that received no condemnation in their immediate context. Shechem, however, gets another different origin story for its shrines Massabot, found in Joshua 24. In the story set at the end of the conquest, Joshua is renewing the covenant between the Israelites and Yahweh. Quote, Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God, and he took a large stone and set it up there under the oak in the sanctuary of Yahweh. Joshua said to all the people, See, this stone shall be a witness against us, for it has heard all the words of Yahweh that he spoke to us. Therefore it shall be a witness against you if you deal falsely with your God. A second positive mention of Massabot is found in the prophetic writings of Isaiah, who dreams of a day when Judah will get revenge on Egypt and Yahweh will rule over them, with the idea being that the Egyptians will become so enamored with their new God that they will even cry out to him in times of need. Quote from chapter 19. On that day there will be an altar to Yahweh in the midst of the land of Egypt and a pillar to Yahweh at its border. It will be a sign and a witness to Yahweh of armies in the land of Egypt. When they cry to Yahweh because of oppressors, he will send them a savior and will defend and deliver them. And so these standing stones, these Massabot, one real, one hoped for, escape condemnation by the redactors of the texts. But that's the exception, as the people who put these texts together mostly wanted all worship directed to the temple in Jerusalem, to the exclusion of these mountaintop shrines and sacred boundary stones and monumental stones. A few chapters earlier in Isaiah, in criticizing the king of Babylon, the book states that the king of Babylon has arrogantly made himself into a high god, saying in chapter 14, I will ascend to heaven, above the stars of El. I will set my throne on high. I will dwell on the mount of the divine council, on the recesses of Zaphon. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like Elyon. Zaphon, in this case, is a mountain currently called Jebel Akra on the coastal border between Turkey and Syria. The word Zaphon also means north, which means that sometimes it's unclear if it's specifically Jebel Akra that's being referenced, rather than merely using it as shorthand for the mythic mountain home of the gods in the north. But often it's much clearer. Zaphon is mentioned in the Baal cycle from Ugarit as being the mountain of Baal, though it was also the mountain of the Hurrian storm god Teshub, and would later be known as the mountain of the local manifestation of the Greek storm god Zeus, who could likewise be recontextualized away from Olympus as needed. Indeed, there are Olympuses everywhere for those with eyes to see. Olympuses? Olympusi? How do you pluralize that? Anyway, Isaiah is not alone in noting Zaphon as the true mountain of Yahweh, the Most High, as the true Mount Zion. Psalm 48 reads like this, quote, Great is Yahweh and greatly to be praised in the city of our God. His holy mountain, beautiful in elevation, is the joy of all the earth. Mount Zion, in the far north, the city of the great king. Within its citadels, God has shown himself a sure defense. Hold on a second, you say. Mount Zion isn't in the far north. Jerusalem is in the south. What gives? Good catch. In this case, the word being translated as north is, you guessed it, Zaphon, which would have been in the far north to the writer of the psalm. It likely preserves a tradition that equates Zion not with the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, but with the cosmic home of the gods to the north. Just like Lebanon's cedar forest could be thought by some biblical authors, including Isaiah, to be a place where the gods lived, similar to Gilgamesh, again, for those who missed the episode. In Psalm 20, the author writes this, quote, May Yahweh answer you on the day of distress. The name of Jacob's God make you safe. may he send help to you from the sanctum, and from Zion may he sustain you. But at Elephantine, an Egyptian town that held a community of Yahwehs who migrated there from Israel and Judah, a papyrus was found that seems to preserve an older version of the same psalm. And the last line of the quoted part of this version instead reads as follows, "And from Zaphon may Adonai sustain us." And that would have been written down after the exile, meaning even hundreds of years from our present moment. After the supposed centralization of the cult in Jerusalem, there were still some who viewed Zaphon as the true home of Yahweh, as the true Zion. But before we get to Yahweh, called Adonai in this text, which means Lord, let's go over one last definition for El Shaddai, one that careful listeners will have heard previous guest scholar Seth Sanders refer to on the show. That is El as the god of the Sheddaim. The Sheddaim, also called the Shaddai gods, are mentioned in the Deir Allah inscription, where we hear about Balaam son of Beor, the prophet who in the Bible chatted with the donkey. We noted in episode 9 that in the inscription he's not a prophet of Yahweh, but instead mentions El and the sun god Shamash. Something else notable is that he recounts a story or vision about seeing a council of the gods, the divine council, where the Sheddaim are mentioned as among the council or perhaps as being the council of the gods. In the ancient oracles assigned to Balaam that we discussed in episode 9, some of the oldest poetry in the Bible, we find this from Numbers 24, quote, "The oracle of Balaam, son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eye is clear, the oracle of one who hears the words of God and knows the knowledge of Elyon, who sees the vision of Shaddai." So while the connection between Balaam, son of Beor, in Deir Allah and the book of Numbers is unclear, at the very least they both mention Shaddai in some context, one Sheddaim, one El Shaddai. Another seemingly related term is found in Deuteronomy 32. Now, this is the same archaic poetry that in verse 8 and 9 views Yahweh as a second-tier god in El's pantheon, as we've discussed a few times on the show. It also contains another contested term, Shedim. Yes, it sounds similar, but it's spelled slightly different. Here's how it's often translated. This one's from the New Jewish Publication Society translation, the NJPS. Quote, "They incensed Yahweh with alien things, vexed him with abominations. They sacrificed to demons, no gods, gods they had never known." The word translated as demons there is Shedim, which would later become the name for demons in general. But this was not always the case. The Jewish Study Bible commentary on the passage notes that this is better translated as protective spirits. The Shedim were not demons, at least not originally, and they may have been El Shaddai's own subordinate gods. And this is where we can talk about the Shedim and their Mesopotamian cousins, the Anunnaki. How much overlap there was between these two groups of warrior gods is a bit speculative, but let's proceed. See, if El Shaddai is El, the god of the Shedim or Shaddai gods, protective spirits often associated with care for the dead, that gives us a different picture entirely of how El Shaddai was viewed by those who gave him that moniker. The Anunnaki are at the center of a lot of today's dumbest conspiracy theories.
In the Garden of Eden story, of course, the serpent tries to convince Eve to eat this apple or whatever it is, consume this drug so that we will become like gods. That's what the Bible says. And when we did eat it, again, in the Bible, there is a plurality. After we eat it, God says they have become like one of us. God says they have become like one of us. And again, if you understand the ancient historical context, who they were talking about, these us were the Anunnaki.
But in antiquity, the Anunnaki had a few different roles, which we don't have time to get into today. Sometimes there are only 7 of them, and sometimes they're described as the great gods, like in the Baal cycle. But one place they popped up before in our big-ass story is in episode 5 on Gilgamesh. In the appended ending, the appending if you will, we get the story about Enkidu's descent into the underworld. And part of the point of this appendix is that Gilgamesh becomes the lord of the underworld gods, the Anunnaki. But in other versions of the tale, when Gilgamesh is talking to the flood hero Utnapishti, he says that the Anunnaki themselves are the ones who held the council to set a limit on the lifespans of humans. They're no longer the underworld gods, but are instead the great gods, worthy of holding the gods' council. And it's this council that seems to be described in Balaam, son of Beor's Dear Allah inscription, placing the Shaddai gods as the council rather than the Anunnaki. One potential reconstruction of the fragmentary inscription is that the Shaddai gods rise up against the top tier of the pantheon, which would have included El and Shamash. Perhaps it's this rebellion that led to the later idea of them as demons, but that is incredibly speculative on my part, and not necessarily something I've seen supported by scholarship. It's almost certainly not true, but it's tempting to think of a development that's so linear. That's usually not how things work, unfortunately. Because developments like this take place over centuries, there's not one single lore master or cultic authority, even as an institution, who guides the changes. They take a long time to stick, and older conceptions can live on alongside these mutations. But regardless of how it came about, the negative view of the Shedim would lead to their later characterization as evil spirits and demons, and the author of Psalm 106, in recounting that the Israelites went astray and worshipped the Shedim, says that, quote, they sacrificed their sons and their daughters to the Shedim, end quote. Because of these later developments, Shedim is usually translated, again, as demons or strange gods, as the recipients of child sacrifice. That may not seem unfair, but, and this might seem a little shocking, receiving child sacrifice didn't necessarily make a god evil or demonic. If you listen carefully earlier during Lewis's description of who El is not, you may have noted that he specified that El is not associated with human sacrifice. And to paraphrase the old tweet, my not involved with human sacrifice t-shirt has people asking a lot of questions already answered by my shirt. So I suppose it's time to open a can of worms. Baal and Yahweh both seem to have had some kind of association with human sacrifice, especially child sacrifice. It's something we'll do an entire episode on in the future, and we'll probably touch on it briefly in the next episode, but there is an overwhelming emphasis on prohibiting child sacrifice in parts of the Bible, and in explaining why child sacrifice happened, that gives us a good indication that it was a genuine issue that needed addressing. So while I know you're all excited about such a fun topic, you'll have to take a rain check on the child sacrifice for now, except to note that El was not a god traditionally associated with child sacrifice, while Yahweh and Baal were. That out of the way, it's time we move on from deciding where El Shaddai is the god of Breast Mountain, the steppe wilderness, the Shedim, or some combination of the three. The decision is ultimately yours. Instead, let's give Yahweh the floor to make his grand entrance. At best, we've met him before as the name of a location or a people in the 1300s, the Shasu of Yahoo or something along those lines. But now, in the mid-800s, he finally starts showing up on the scene, and despite his long disappearance, if that even was him back in the late Bronze Age, he will frankly never leave us again. The question is, of course, if there's something visible in the Bible that tells us who originally worshipped Yahweh, where they came from, and whether he started off as this Levantine storm warrior god, or if he was some other kind of god who merely inherited much of the lore of Baal and El. To put it another way, if we look at our oldest poetry and traditions in the Bible and strip away everything tied to El and Baal, do we have enough evidence to reconstruct the older Yahweh? And this is the part where there's a lot of speculation. With most gods, it's nearly impossible to find where their exact origins come from. Whoever originally named these gods and told their earliest mythology would rarely, if ever, write them down. It would take generations for them to make their way into the written record. Even someone who becomes as popular as the Aten during Akhenaten's reign predated him by centuries, and Akhenaten's version of Aten differed from how those who came before him imagined the Aten. The Aten, you'll recall, was only worshipped as a sun disk in his favorite pharaoh's time, but previously he had been conceived as a falcon-headed god like Re, and possibly also associated at times with volcanoes and metallurgy to some degree. So finding these quote-unquote origins doesn't necessarily help us to understand what made them popular with those who venerated them the most. Gods change their shape to fill the social container they're in, always, without exception. They contain echoes of their past, and those echoes can themselves shape their later form, but they inevitably morph over time. And usually there's not much at stake in these searches for origins beyond saying, well, probably sometime in the 2nd or 3rd millennium, someone worshipped a version of this god and his or her legend grew over the centuries and came to look like this instead. But with Yahweh's origins, even otherwise sharp scholars can end up overemphasizing a focus on when and where Yahweh came from. There's a cultural bias here, which I guess is something even this show is guilty of to some extent. In a vacuum, trying to trace the origins of a god so insignificant in the broader scheme of things is a bit pointless and doesn't tell us much about the later folks who worshipped a later version of him. They worshipped the god who was influenced by Baal and conflated with El. Part of me would love to talk to all of you a bit more about West Asian history and mythology on its own, and I do try to do that, but none of that would gain as much traction as talking about Yahweh in the Bible. And as someone who grew up as a Bible-believing Christian, I also have my own bias toward discussing this god and the relatively minor Iron Age kingdoms who patronized him. That's just my own bias. So with that caveat out of the way, let's dive into Yahweh's origins, whoever this god was before he came into contact with El and Baal. This part is based on a few sources, including a fair bit from Nissim Amsalag's work. I've linked one of his articles in the episode description. In the south of Judah, or perhaps south of Judah in the Sinai or northwestern desert wilderness of Saudi Arabia, lived a people called the Kenites. Apparently, they were famous as coppersmiths and metallurgists. While typically aligned with the Judahites in the biblical texts, they are distinguished to an extent from the Judahites. In Genesis, they're given a confusing origin story, one that places their own inception before the flood that wipes out everyone except for Noah and his family. So then, how did they survive to become the Kenites? Well, that's just another peek into the composite nature of the biblical texts. And in the Kenites' case, despite this glaring literary issue, their origins are traced back nearly to the start of the world. Adam and Eve have 2 sons, first Cain and then Abel. Cain's name is a hint at his eventual fate as the father of metal workers. In Genesis 4, upon giving birth to him, Eve says, "I have got me a man with Yahweh." First oddity there, some scholars have noted that despite the earlier part of the verse stating that she knew Adam, a euphemism for banging, Eve seems to credit Yahweh as her partner in some way. I have produced a man with Yahweh. Some translations add in "with the help of Yahweh" to try and distance it a bit from these saucy implications, but the text has some ambiguity. Second, and more relevant for our story, is a pun that Robert Alter points out in the Hebrew version of the text. When she says, "I have got me a man," the word for "got me" is Cain, or Cain. Cain means smith, Cain can mean to acquire, but it can also mean to make. So the wordplay is that she has smithed the smith, essentially.
And the meaning of Cain is possession.
But despite his name, Cain starts out as an agrarian farmer instead, while his brother Abel is a transhumance pastoralist. He raises sheep, in other words. Yahweh likes Abel's sacrifice of meat, but rejects Cain's agrarian sacrifice. There's no reason given for this, and it seems to be a blind motif left over from a previous shepherd versus farmer story, since Yahweh himself would later accept grain offerings and other agrarian products as a sacrifice in the Torah's laws. These kinds of farmers versus nomad stories were apparently quite common at the time. Yahweh warns Cain not to become jealous, saying, quote, "If you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it." The word for "you must" is timshel, or timshel, I can't pronounce these things, which John Steinbeck in East of Eden has a character argue as better translated, "thou mayest." Is that related to the rest of the episode? No, but I like that book, and it's my show, so fuck you. Anyway, Cain becomes enraged at this rejection and jealous of Abel's acceptance, so he lures Abel into a field and murders him.
But Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and slew him.
Yahweh curses him to wander the earth, And it seems this story was not originally attached to Adam and Eve as the first humans on Earth, because Cain not only stops wandering, but he even finds a wife among a foreign people, despite the implication that Adam, Eve, and Cain were the only three people on the Earth after Abel's untimely death. Cain, as part of the anti-urban polemic that we've discussed a few times on this show, and despite him being cursed to wander the earth, goes on to almost immediately found the world's first city, associating city dwelling with murderers. And the narrative progresses through his genealogy a few generations until we get to Tubal-Cain, a metallurgist who is said to forge every tool of copper and iron. And that's where we see the ideological origin of the Kenites as metallurgic specialists. Adam and Eve have another son who they name Seth, and from there the story gets away from Cain and the Kenites' origins. The whole tale is a bit of a mess as we have it, with half-formed story threads that likely exist as vestiges of older legends, but the fundamental point seems to be to give an origin story for the Kenites as metallurgists who have some relationship to the Judahites and Israelites, even if it's one that's a bit fraught. In the Moses story, when the big man flees from Egypt on his own near the start of the story, he ends up in Midian in the eastern Sinai or northwest Saudi Arabia, where he meets a local girl, Zipporah, and marries her. Later, you'll recall that her father-in-law, the Midianite priest Jethro, meets the Israelites as they're fleeing en masse from Egypt, and he instructs Moses in a few matters of administration. It's never stated which god Jethro is aligned with as a priest, so the assumption seems to be that it's Yahweh. And these southern locales are often associated with Yahweh. His holy mountains, unlike El, Baal, and their mountain Zaphon and other places in Lebanon, are usually located in the Sinai Peninsula or in the northwest Arabian desert. These locations and the prominence of the Midianites and the Kenites in Yahweh's origin stories in the Bible have for many decades led to a fair few scholars proposing what's called the Kenite-Midianite hypothesis. It's the idea that these southern peoples originally worshipped Yahweh before he made his way north into Palestine to become the patron gods of Israel and Judah. The southern desert wilderness is the kind of dangerous, hostile, and liminal place that is often associated with gods and spirits, a space between civilizations where the divine could make their home without the fear of their lethal presence killing their subjects. Yahweh's bright and fiery presence is called his kavod, a word that you may have noticed in the Psalm 29 Baal hymn that we discussed earlier. It's usually translated as glory, but glory, I think, doesn't convey the deadliness of the kavod. In Exodus 34, when Moses goes back up on the mountain and gets the second law tablets after he destroyed the first in a fit of rage, some of Yahweh's kavod even seems to stick to him, because when Moses comes back down from Mount Sinai, quote, Moses was not aware that the skin of his face was radiant, since he had spoken with Yahweh. Aaron and all the Israelites saw the skin of Moses' face was radiant, and they shrank from coming near him. End quote. So divinity is not only lethal, it's contagious. And a righteous person like Moses could get some godliness on him just by being around it, if it didn't kill him first. The word being used to describe the light radiating off of Moses is the Hebrew word for horns, which seems to be used here to essentially denote beams of light emanating from his face, horns of light. Confused Greek and Latin translators of this text later maintained merely the word horns growing out of his skin, which isn't a phrase used in Hebrew. Horns grow out of heads, not facial skin. And this misunderstanding led to Christian artistic depictions of Moses with horns, which in part led to the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory that Jews grow horns. And so if you ever see a guy with horns on an old church, that's Moses, or at least the bizarre goat version of him from late antiquity, robbed of his deadly kavod. And it's the fiery elements of Yahweh and his kavod that Amsalag points to as one piece of evidence, among others, of an older volcanic version of the God that Israel and Judah came to revere so highly. See, when Moses initially goes up Sinai in Exodus 19, it's described as follows, quote, On the morning of the third day there was thunder and lightning, as well as a thick cloud on the mountain and a blast of a trumpet so loud that all the people who were in the camp trembled. Now all of Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke, because the Lord had descended upon it in fire. The smoke went up like the smoke of a kiln, while the whole mountain shook violently. And this association with dark smoke and a furnace is even more explicit in Psalm 97. Quote, "Clouds and thick darkness are all around him. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne. Fire goes before him and consumes his adversaries on every side. His lightnings light up the world. The earth sees and trembles. The mountains melt like wax before Yahweh, before the Lord of all the earth." And Psalm 18, quote, "Then the earth reeled and rocked. The foundations also of the mountains trembled and reeled because he was angry. Smoke went up from his nostrils and devouring fire from his mouth. Glowing coals flamed forth from him." Smoke from his nostrils, fire from his hands, and all-consuming black smoke, mountains melting like wax, and indications throughout the text that Yahweh comes from northwest Saudi Arabia, where there was a fair bit of volcanic activity. There may be something there. Maybe. But so much of this is also associated with other storm gods like Baal, who have firepower and dark clouds and mountaintop locales, so it's hard to say for sure. If Yahweh was associated with erupting mountains that poured out fire, manifesting as his mortal kavod, then there's the further tantalizing connection that, like the Aten, he may have been seen by the Kenites as their god of metallurgy and smithing, a god of copper production, the very thing they're famous for in the story of Cain and his descendants, the very thing the Kenites are famous for in the story of Cain and his descendants. As I hinted in episode 9, the copper snake in the Exodus story as one of Yahweh's supreme cultic images adds fuel to this volcanic fire. And if he's similar to the Aten in having some metallurgy or smelting connotations, as Amtzalag argues, perhaps that's why Psalm 104 bears such a striking resemblance to the great hymn to the Aten, and is possibly the reason why Yahweh was viewed in some ways as a solar deity in that psalm and elsewhere. But, oh boy, are we in the realm of speculation here. The problem is, once again, that we rely on the written record to help us reconstruct history. And the written record in this period is inextricably tied to political and commercial centers. This means that unless our theoretical Kenites and Midianites who worshipped Yahweh had their own centers of significant political power, we're unlikely to find contemporary traces of their veneration of Yahweh, if it existed at all. And so Amtzalag's reconstruction is pretty interesting as far as speculation goes, and his article is worth reading, but it is, at the end of the day, speculation, relying on the much later biblical texts. So while we're speculating, we can touch on Yahweh's name. Because vowels were not included in these early alphabetic scripts, the name of the god is written down as Yod-He-Vav-He. YHWH or YHWH. The Vav is somewhere between a W and a V and can be written down either way. The pronunciation reconstruction Yahuwah is probably right, though it's often shortened at the time to Yahu, Yaho, Yeho, and sometimes just Yah. Hallelujah means praise Yah, for example. Of course, pronunciations change, but Yahweh is still our best guess, and probably a good one. As for the meaning of the god's name, in the Exodus story, when Moses asks for his name, the author adds in a classic folk etymology, like Jacob wrestling God being the source of the term Israel. In Moses' case, the answer he receives is not Yahweh's name, but Eya Esher Eya, usually translated, I am who I am.
I am what I am. What I'm not, see, I never be. Niggas whooping up until we meet.
Or I will be who I will be. Amtzalag argues, among other scholars, that it probably means he who blows, associating Yahweh with the wind, which would fit with him as a storm god or a god of smelting. On the other hand, more common theories are a bit less exciting, though still interesting, usually something closer to he who exists, or he who is, or he who will be, in some sense and in some tense. Maybe something like he who causes existence, fitting for a storm god linked to creation mythology. This isn't exactly uncommon for a god of this era. They usually emphasize their power, their chieftainship, and so on. So while there likely will never be enough evidence to sort it out for sure, the less exciting option is usually the right one. We'll call Yahweh he who exists. And he's definitely a he, a male god in this period. Though in describing him, the later prophet Ezekiel sort of glosses over his genitals, instead describing the glowing kavod, that, like a blurring TV sensor, shines a bright light which obscures the divine dong, leaving later interpreters to speculate on whether or not figures like Yahweh and Adam were circumcised. According to one Ugaritic text, El himself reverses his waning virility by pruning his branch. Male circumcision had existed in the Middle East and North Africa for 1,500 years or more before Yahweh's grand entrance on the scene, though some cultures would adopt and drop the practice at various times. But it became an important identity marker for the people who wrote, compiled, and passed along the biblical texts. So we'll give it a 50-50 shot of whether Yahweh himself inherited the trimmed penis of his forebears in the minds of the authors. Later reimaginings of Yahweh will absorb some of Asherah's womanly functions to some degree, and over time we will get a god who sometimes transcends sex and gender, but for the time being he's a guy. A really big guy, but definitely a guy. So what can we say about pre-biblical Yahweh then? We don't know a lot about his background. He seems to be from the south somewhere, though he first finds a lot of popularity in the north. His name has a few reconstructions that seem plausible, mostly. He might be a god of metallurgy of some kind, with some solar elements as well. Outside of that, most information is speculative and based on the Bible, making the logic around who he was and where he came from based on mainly circular reasoning, selective readings, and speculation. Some of it worthwhile, but still speculation. And it's this received text that we primarily have to work with. We'll deal with Yahweh's character, his nature, what it means to be holy, and more as he develops. But even if he had different origins as a metallurgic god, he seems to have pretty quickly adapted into being a storm warrior god, who then absorbed El and inherited his wife Asherah to become the head of the Israelite and Judahite pantheons. He has local manifestations that are visible in the Kuntalet Ajrud inscriptions. In addition to Yahweh of Samaria, we also have Yahweh of Teman, a word that indicates a southern locale. Teman and Negev were both used as specific locations, but also as a general southern direction, among other words for south, similar to the way we discussed Zaphon as being a real place on the border of Syria and Turkey, but also as a general referent of the north. But Yahweh's most famous name modifier is not a localization. It's Yahweh Tsabaoth, commonly translated Lord of Hosts. The hosts in question are not neutral parties, but his divine soldiers. It's Yahweh of armies. One of the ways Yahweh manifests his holiness is as the divine warrior. And what's more important in our social realities is the idea of godly warfare, a topic we discussed at length in episode 6 on divine conquest. And this warrior status is what made gods like this so appealing to political figures like Ahab and his predecessors throughout ancient West Asia. Yahweh is one more storm warrior god whose powerful lore made him an easy fit for the top of the royal cult, like his predecessors Marduk, Zeus, and Baal. Whether these violent aspects were inherent to him as a god or were grafted on entirely or primarily from Baal is almost irrelevant. He would either have to be that kind of conquering deity, adapt to become one, or disappear into the sands of time. You don't become the political patron god of a monarchy at the time without these violent characteristics. Despite or perhaps because of the similarities between Yahweh and Baal, worshiping Yahweh and decidedly not Baal seems to have become an important identity marker for later Israelites like the author of Hosea, who condemns the worship of one of Yahweh's own source gods. In the view of Hosea and many other anti-Baal authors, the worship of Baal is the worship of the larger kingdoms around them, who ruled over them and or kept them bound to lopsided trade agreements. They're oppressors, in other words. And with that oppression in mind, the later condemnation of Baal worshippers like Ahab and Jezebel, in the face of the eventual destruction of Samaria by the Neo-Assyrians, seems on its face to be at least somewhat understandable, though obviously the violent treatment of Jezebel would remain terrible, even if there was some truth to her bringing the cult of Baal into the royal court of Samaria, which isn't a guarantee. And in fact, there's something that significantly complicates that idea, and it's this. You're going to want to sit down for this one. Are you sitting down? Ahab and Jezebel's 3 children are all named after Yahweh. Jehoram, Yahweh is exalted. Athaliah, dealt with by Yahweh. And Ahaziah, grasped by Yahweh. Let me restate that. Despite their portrayal in the Bible as heretical Baal worshippers, they named all of their children after Yahweh, a god who seems to have been new on the scene, and who Frevel argues was first venerated by Omri, or perhaps even Ahab as the patron god of Israel. Ahab and Jezebel are the first couple to name all of their children after Yahweh. The specific dating for this is a bit speculative, and the association of Yahweh first with Ahab conflicts with Frevel's own view in his Ancient Israel history book, where he seems to believe that Jehoshaphat is perhaps the first Judahite king who we can confidently place in the historical record, and, well, he's called Jehoshaphat, meaning Yahweh has judged. So unless Jehoshaphat, who is contemporary with Ahab, was around 6 or 7 years old when he took the throne, or we have a several-decade misalignment in dating, it's unlikely that Ahab's children with Yahwistic names predated him. In that case, it makes it at best a bit of guesswork to have our royal Israelite couple as the first to venerate Yahweh in any way, but it remains remarkable that Ahab and Jezebel endlessly loathed as Baal worshippers, or Baalers as they're known academically, are our first confirmable royal Yahwists, launching this god to previously unknown heights as their kingdom also reached its pinnacle. Jehoshaphat, for all his jumping, never had that kind of legacy. The reality behind them as historical figures is, therefore, difficult to untangle from the rhetoric of the biblical texts, similar to finding the real Yahweh underneath Baal and El, if there really was a distinction in such terms. Was he a volcano and smelting god? Was he merely another Baal whose name got switcherooed? Does his name mean the blower, or the one who exists, or the one who causes to exist? I can't tell you, and I'm not sure it really matters. But despite Yahweh taking on Baal's thunderous persona and storm god lore, there would be later authors, even those who reveled in the violence and destruction of Yahweh's enemies, who could see him in a different light. Next episode, we'll finish the story of Ahab and Jezebel. Their main foil in the Book of Kings is the prophet Elijah, or Eliah, if you're being pedantic. And after he flees from Jezebel, he has an encounter that paints Yahweh in a light that's curiously different from all the divine power and violence we've seen so far. Quote from 1 Kings 19. Yahweh said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before Yahweh, for Yahweh is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before Yahweh. But Yahweh was not in the wind. And after the wind an earthquake. But Yahweh was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake a fire. But Yahweh was not in the fire. And after the fire a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle, and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" But this fascinating encounter with Yahweh, this soft-spoken theophany, is the exception, not the rule. When we return to Jezebel and Ahab, despite their apparent elevation of Yahweh, despite this peaceful manifestation of the divine with Elijah, we will encounter some vicious and hate-filled rhetoric that, while probably not historical, has certainly left a long trail of real destruction. And that's where we'll pick up next time on the Bible Lore Podcast. Make sure to support the show by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Bible Lore Podcast. I'll see you next time.